Hi Dave, welcome to In Conversation with Dave. It's amazing to have you here, and we will directly deep dive into the core crux of our podcast today, and that's mental health. So the first question that I really want to understand is we have so many, so many conversations happening about mental health, but of course, the taboo still exists, right? So the very first question is the basic one, of course. Why do you think there's so much taboo surrounding mental health even now? Hi Dave, thank you so much for having me. And I'm glad that you've started the podcast with this question because this is the most asked question wherever I go. So it has a very basic answer, and I believe that no one has ever come to this realization, but I feel I'm glad that I got this answer. And the answer is very simple. It's just that we were never taught to look at mental health as a health issue. Now, why do I say it is because think about it. When let's say you're seeing a Colgate's ad, right? It's about dental hygiene. And if you remember back then, years, we have continuously consumed the same content. It was advertised everywhere on mass media. We have been seeing it on TVs. We have been seeing it on, let's say you go to a movie, you see those advertisements. You go to any billboards, there are probably many billboards, many posters. So basically you've been taught that dental hygiene, for that matter, even sexual hygiene, right? You have been taught that this is how you need to brush, this is how Colgate helps you, or this is how toothpaste are important. These are the things that toothpaste must have. And at the similar manner, we also see sexual health. We got to know that condoms are important, right? The benefits of condoms, why should you choose it? And why do you use it? So we were all taught that these are the things that's really important, and there are also solutions to it. But mental health was never taught to us in terms of the mass media effect. When there's a certain thing that you don't talk about, it becomes a taboo, right? For a longer period, if you don't talk about it, it becomes a taboo. So this is the only reason why. Of course, there are many other reasons as well, but this is the most important, that why India looks at mental health as a taboo even today. It's because it was not advertised enough for us. We were not aware of it enough. But right now, I believe the conversations have started, so I'm really happy about it. But the more serious problem is that India still doesn't realize the currency value of mental health that we are losing every year. I think that's more serious. Right. You just mentioned that India do not realize the currency value of mental health. Can you explain? What do you mean by that? Yeah, what I mean is that in India, of course, we don't realize the currency value of mental health because the losses are massive, but it is invisible. Now, why do I say it is invisible? Is because according to the estimates by WHO and ILO, India is projected to lose close to $1 trillion between 2012 to 2030 because of anxiety related or depression related productivity loss. And that's massive. To put you in perspective, that's around 12 to 15 billion dollars every single year that we're losing. But the real cost isn't just economic. It shows up as burned out employees who can't fully function, families that slowly break under emotional crisis, emotional strain, relationships that fail, and trauma that gets passed down to generations, right? So it's not about just the economic format of it. I also want you to focus on the socio-cultural aspects and the effects that it actually causes. And if we actually look at it very closely, mental health is the base of how human beings function. And that's the real currency. Because of, let's say, your mental health isn't right, there would be productivity loss, your families will suffer, you will not have a healthy relationship with anyone. And of course, that will also lead to self-harm at some point of time. No, I actually never looked at it that way, but it's just amazing. And thank you so much for bringing that here. But what is the current landscape that we have, when we talk about, when you just mentioned that the currency value of mental health and we are losing so much, every year. I want to understand what's the current landscape of mental health as of now. What's the current landscape? The current landscape of mental health in India, it's actually very fragmented. Why I say fragmented is because we have 10,000 odds psychiatrists for, let's say, 1.4 billion people in India. and that's way too less. When we talk about psychologists, we have 2 for every 1 lakh people in India, which is less than 3x what WHO has advised. And if you look at it very closely, that all the awareness part or all the help that is available today for mental health in India, we have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and the focus is only on tier 1. I wouldn't say only, but the most of it is on tier 1. Tier 2, tier 3, it's as if it doesn't exist, or even if it exists, there are very few people or very few organizations that are working towards it effectively. Okay, so this is something that I really want to add here. What I'm also mentioning right now is the treatment gap. But in India, of course, treatment gap exists, but more than that, there is another problem that comes even before the treatment gap. And that's actually much more serious. Wait, so treatment gap is not the real problem. What's the real problem? What do you mean by the real problem starts even before the treatment gap? Please explain, please. So the main problem in India is not actually the treatment gap. The main problem is actually, if I may term it as, the help seeking gap. Because most of the people in India, they don't reach a stage where they are actually seeking help, right? So let's say a person X is going through a problem. What he or she will do is they will wait it out. They will assume that it's just stress, it's just a minor hiccup that they are going through, and they wait it out. Yeah, so they basically wait it out. They don't give much importance to it. They suffer in silence. They don't talk about it. And it happens for like days and months and weeks. And somehow they come out of it, of course. But the problem is they never reach to a psychologist when they're actually going through, or a psychiatrist when they're actually going through a problem. They only reach when it is out of hands, when they're at a breaking point. And at that point, most of the cases are very severe and the damage is already done. So the problem, what I mentioned, is not just the treatment gap, but the help seeking gap. Because we look at mental health not as preventive care. We look at it as a last resort help, and that's the problem. But why don't people seek help? Why don't people seek help? Because when it comes to, let's say, I go through a certain problem. Let's say I have headache. I go to a doctor. Let's say I have a fever, viral fever. I go to a doctor, seek help. Why don't people seek help when it comes to mental health yet? Right, of course, there are lots of conversations happening and there are lots of help available as well. But still, people in India do not seek help as much as compared to the other countries. Is because they feel seeking mental health treatments or seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist is a threat to their identity. It's not about just health. It feels like you're risking your family's image, your marriage prospects, and in men especially, it's masculinity, right? So mental health is rarely seen as I'm unwell. Instead, it's internalized as something is wrong in me as a person, right? So we don't look at us that we are suffering through a problem. No, we feel that we are the problem, and that's the main issue. The fear of being judged or labeled keeps people silent even when they're struggling deeply. So until we change this mindset, until we change this whole narrative, I don't think people will seek help, or as much as we want to, right? And I think it's high time again, people should start these conversations. It's really important. Right. Wonderful. Right, so moving on, I want to actually understand this, and I think this is really important. I want to understand, do all the generations face the same issues, or does the mental health issues change in terms of generation? What do you think? Every generation has their own set of problems. And what millennials were taught whenever they faced mental health issues was to internalize it, right? So when we talk about the kind of problems or issues that millennials faced, it was more about job stability, pressure, emotional suppression, and hustle culture, right? So the idea was to push through, stay quiet, and keep going even when things felt overwhelming. But when it comes to Gen Zs are obviously very vocal about mental health issues, but they also face certain problems, and the problems are non-stop comparison, digital identity pressure, climate anxiety, career uncertainty, and of course, nothing too much is good for your health, right? So what Gen Zs go through, the biggest problem is that there's an overload of emotions that they're feeling, that they're processing. So their struggles are basically more visual, more talked about, and more public, but the pain hasn't disappeared. It's still the same. But don't you think, but when you say Gen Zs are more vocal and yet they're not seeking help, what do you mean by that? I want to understand that. Of course, Gen Zs, they talk about their problems very openly, they're very vocal basically when it comes to mental health issues. But even when they're vocal, that doesn't mean that help is there, right? So expression doesn't always mean the availability of support or help, right? Now, what I mean by that is, of course, Gen Z have problems they've expressed, but are the institutions that's around them actually works on solving those issues? The workspaces are the same. When we go to any education institution, somehow, unfortunately, the education system still rewards performance over well-being. So, of course, they openly talk about it, but when it comes to the institutions that are around them, they fail them. And when this happens continuously, of course, they don't feel safe anymore, right? And they doubt if whenever they express or they try to seek help or they show it to people that those are around them, they fear they doubt if their problems will be heard without judgment or without consequences, right? So of course, Gen Zs are expressing it, but then the institutions are actually failing them. You and us are failing them. Right. I want to ask this question again. India, as you mentioned, India is divided into tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, right? So I want to understand, since you've mentioned about the generational problems that we face, the problems that millennials face are completely different than the problems that Gen Z face. I want to understand what problems do again tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities, villages in India face. In India, mental health is again categorized as tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Now tier 1 is where all the cities comes in, right? The metropolitan cities, the cosmopolitan cities, Hyderabad, Kolkata, Delhi, Mumbai, etc., right? So in these places, people have different problems. People have problems such as burnout, loneliness, relationship issues, right? But when we go little lower to tier 2, the problems are more about comparison, constant comparison, meeting family expectations, being successful. These problems are more aspirational related problems when you go to tier 2. Now, when you go to tier 3, the problems are basic and very severe, because this section of people, they suffer problems such as financial stability, right? They suffer problems such as domestic abuse. And of course, when I say that these are the problems that the tier 1, 2, 3 face, I don't mean that these are the only problems that they face. Of course, there are overlaps, but mostly if we categorize, these are the problems. So tier 1, burnout issues, relationship issues, etc. Tier 2, we have aspirational issues such as meeting family expectations, financial stability, etc. And when we come to tier 3, it's more about abuse, domestic abuse, trauma, and these are very severe. So if you ask me what's the severity, I would say tier 1 comes under 7 to 8 on a scale of 10. Tier 2 comes between 8 to 9. But when it comes to tier 3, it's actually 10 out of 10, because that's the place where help is much more needed and support is very, very limited. The main question that I really want to understand as a conclusion is, what can we do to start changing this narrative of mental health in India? What are the things that we can start doing from now on, or should continuously do as well? All right, so to actually bring change and to change the landscape of mental health in India, the very basic things, to be very honest, Dave, you don't have to, it's not rocket science at all. It's very simple. But of course, when I say simple, doesn't mean it's easy. It's simple, but hard. So the first things that we need to do as a society, as a community, to change the landscape of mental health is that we need to talk about it more, right? Just how, or start conversations more in a much more mass media effect that I mentioned before. So we need to start talking about it, to normalize it, to show people that it's normal. You don't have to be alone. You don't have to be you don't have to struggle. This is the first thing that we can do as a society. The second is we need to start treating mental health as first aid, not crisis care, right? So we have to change that narrative, because we all go to mental support, or most of the people go to mental support only when they are at a breaking point. So we need to change that narrative as well. So from crisis support to first aid is something that we have to bring in. And third, the most important, is that mental health needs to be integrated in the very grassroots levels, right? It should be integrated in communities such as schools, colleges, in corporates. Of course, there's certain integration already happening in India, but more rigorously, right? With lots more faster execution, and making sure that it's effectively executed as well, not just execution. And I think once these are done, I think India would be finally free of people not seeking help, right? Because treatment, of course, some might come, treatment gap, I think that's another story that we have to discuss. That will definitely be solved in India for sure. But as I mentioned, the problem before it, the help seeking gap, I think that would be completely reduced once we start doing it. And when we overdo it over a period of time, I think it would be solved very soon. Hopefully, maybe perhaps in the next 2 to 3 years, I think we should be seeing some great shift in the mindset of people. Thank you so much for having me. Right, it was great having you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here.